Hello everyone, today with enthusiasm we talk about the French Légion, étrangère. You know that I'm pulping up a little bit like the more modern contemporary warfare content, so I thought that this was a very important chapter. Born in 1831, in fact, the French Foreign Legion rapidly evolved into one of the most well-trained and efficient corps of the French army, actively engaged and operational in the major theaters of war. Today we want to draw like a simple introduction to the history of the French Foreign Legion. And first of all, answering this question, that is to say, why would a powerful nation like France, that really set the gold standards of the world military, and that also provided, like with a strong military tradition, historically by that point established a legion composed solely of foreign citizens. And also, other question, how is it possible that men, this is very interesting, from such different backgrounds and educations can still form to this day one of the most tenacious, combative, and reliable forces in the world, right? And of course, it's a history of further tradition, of blood, of pain, because the birth of the Foreign Legion and its history sort of follows also some of the most painful chapters in French history. All right, and it's actually a consequence of the end of the First Empire. All right, of all the military units still in operation. For this reason, the French Foreign Legion is undoubtedly the most unusual. Arguably, its notoriety rests not only on this glorious military action that counts, in fact, really an incredible long list of heroic episodes, but also on the aura of mystery surrounding the same soldiers that, as you know, initially were volunteers from the globe, fundamentally, who forsake their names and past, sometimes marred by crimes, by the way, to embark on this new life under the banner of the legionary flame. So, the origin of the unit historically is crucial to understand the origins of the same elite corps that evolved like as such over time. And a time that we have thus to reverse. So at the end of the Napoleonic era, there were so many soldiers, we're talking about in the thousands, of course, from various nationalities, who had fought in Bonaparte's armies. And that the Restoration had rendered unemployed. You know, we talk often about Napoleon and let's say his significance, not merely in an historical sense, but in a cultural one, in the sort of traditional perspective. And you know, of course, how revolutionary, in spite of the imperial nature eventually of his regime, of course, the ideas that he infused all over Europe during his conquests really were. There was essentially a principle of at least claimed and relative, actually, if you look at the different rights in that sense of all citizens of a country, something that was applied not just to France, but in fact to the various republics that were created during the Napoleonic wars, in fact at the expenses of ancien regimes all over the continent, that thus had, after 1815, to confront themselves with the fact that the virus was in, right? The degree of liberty that had been provided to the foretators, to the commoners, the possibility of these to actually succeed in building up some governments capable of rivaling, mostly through the bourgeoisie that was the actually competitive estate here. Actually, the foretators were the useful cannon fodder, of course, but still relevant, of course, as a mass, like we're talking about the age of mass society now, and that also morally and sort of physically had had definitely an impact, as showed by the massive baths, unprecedented baths of blood in the history of mankind that the Napoleonic Wars had really been, rivaling with probably the Ancien Regime institutions and governments, which was rendered all the... We will talk about the Restoration in general, but this is always the point, something that the same French military historically had, the same French governments had tried to prevent from happening within the same France until the French Revolution, and or at least until other revolutions that were instead effectively suppressed historically during the Jacquerie, the wars of religion, the Fronde, etc. It is to say, arming large amounts of people and providing them, in fact, with a hell of a military experience like the one they had not just under Napoleon, but often also from on the other side, right? As the Ancien Regime had been obliged to extend actually the enlistment on for having solid enough armies to compete with the French ones, the ones stemming from the Jacobin model, had brought to so many people who knew how to, in fact, make war at an unprecedented level within society. And so, during I'd say after the Restoration, so in an age of tendentially repressive and police policies, such individuals, especially those who, of course, retained some sort of Jacobin, Republican, constitutional ideas, were looked upon with suspicion. Right, with the Napoleonic imperial insignia fallen and their uniforms discarded, these soldiers had returned to their homelands with little hope of actual reintegration into civilian life from their side. They knew that, of course, they would have been blamed, they would have been stigmatized. It's an aspect that we often don't remember, having served, even just compulsorily, to the Napoleonic armies. Think about, the vast amount of Germans, of Poles, of Italians, etc., that had served in the hundreds of thousands, in fact, under Napoleon. Think about the invasion of Russia, which was the largest example, but throughout all this period, were now, of course, to really concretely acknowledge what the price of this had been politically, socially, and also militarily. As we've seen, they were regarded now with suspicion by the governments of the Restoration in their own homeland, as they were seen as potentially turbulent elements. And some of them were terrorists, they were agitators, they were participating to secret societies, organizing essentially revolution once again. And the revolutionary fervor had not yet subsided. On the contrary, right? The Restoration had succeeded in restoring an order in Europe, but socially speaking and politically within all the states, it would be, as you know, great movements of revolt, of uprising, for different reasons, right? Some countries had also fallen once again back under somebody else's heel, so it wasn't just a merely social issue, it was a national one as well. And as a result, all these veterans, in many ways, were soon forced into exile by numerous European states. Consequently, many were compelled to return where? Well, to the one other European nation with which they had shared this connection. France, right? A country that maybe they had never seen, but that they had definitely heard its tongue. They had to learn in the ranks of their former units. Now, in the same France, and here I'm skipping brutally, sort of major topics of 19th century history, but as you know, over 3 sultry days in July 1830, a revolution deposed the French king Charles X of Bourbon. Right, the Bourbon had been restored after 1815. Actually, even before that, cross out Napoleon's 100 days, but that was the thing. Instead of reinstating the Republic, however, the revolutionaries elevated to the throne a distant cousin of Charles, hailing from the cadet branch of the Orléans. We're talking about Louis-Philippe d'Orléans. He chose to be known, given the support that he received for his regime, as the King of the French, rather than the King of France, right? Because that sounded sort of more popular, as his predecessors had declared themselves properly rulers by God will over, or for at least, a French people. This new title emphasized the constitutional and liberal nature of Louis Philippe. And again, the context is complex, of course. This had to do with the repressive means that had been used in the past decade, and loss of internal balance. This dynastic substitution, whether actually was always within the same Bourbon dynasty, is known as the July Revolution. And the political changes initiated by Louis-Philippe of Orléans reignited fears and tensions in several European nations. Why? Because essentially it was believed that now France had sort of reinstated, a masked Republican revolutionary government that would have had some sort of dire effect, if not militarily. They thought about that too, but politically, definitely fueling on the embers of the aforementioned revolutionaries in all the other countries. And so, through the influx of exiles into Paris, that some of them have already been there, just aside from their military past, as they were fleeing from, the repression imposed by the respective governments. The nascent regime was actually more focused on consolidating its internal power, stabilizing, in fact, the French political climate. But it also was tasked with managing a considerable number of unemployed and, as we've seen, unrest-prone foreigners who posed, within the same France, a threat to public order. This was really the age of revolutions, and I really don't understand people who say that the 19th century is some sort of peaceful century. It was actually one of the bloodiest, most violent, even crossing out the Napoleonic beginning. There were so many different wars. Actually, the French Foreign Legion will illustrate some of these, and not just abroad, colonially, but within the same Europe. And the problem was concrete, because yes, the current government was a monarchical one, but it, of course, contained many elements of, possible, let's say, shifting towards sort of more revolutionary extremes, especially thanks to the support of this manpower, right? These nostalgic veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, who in part had kept believing in those values and those principles, and would have liked to apply it not just in their homeland, but starting again from France after the Restoration. Now, although Louis-Philippe of Orléans was a peaceful king, France had recently entered into a war with essentially Algeria. And consequently, by a decree dated March the 9th, 1831, the king decided to use the aforementioned refugees to establish a, quote, legion composed of foreigners that will bear the name of the Foreign Legion, right? The foreign legions, foreign units had not really been a strange thing historically. We talked also about the Freikorps. We talked about, mercenarism from, very, very old time, like medieval, ancient. And it had always been a thing. It was completely normal. Now, the problem is that in an age of nationalism and of nation-state more precisely, and what a better example than France, of course, there had to be a reason why these forces, in fact, were chosen properly as such. Now, this Foreign Legion was intended to become an integral part of the French army. And as such, it was modeled on the pre-existing national infantry regiments, some of which, as we will see now, were fundamentally included. Right? France had an old history, as you know, of Swiss, German mercenaries, palace guards, a bit just like the Pope. They weren't the only ones. So this early Foreign Legion was conceived just as the continuation of that, like a grouping of such regiments featuring the same personnel and uniform. Already at this point, however, the reason for this grouping was not to keep using these forces just as an integration to the national ones to defend, say, France, the French mainland, but properly designated and actually exclusively for operations beyond national borders, which of course tells you immediately why, right? Essentially, the same French government was afraid of these troops. They wanted to send them away so that they wouldn't become some manpower used by revolutionaries. And these people were initially, in fact, minded in that direction, in the direction of subversion and insurrection. Now, to form the core of the first 3 battalions of this new unit, the Foreign Legion, 2 existing foreign regiments already serving in the French armies, in fact, 1 Swiss and 1 German, were actually disbanded. So it brought into the Foreign Legion that at this point had actually still like such internal divisions present. A 4th battalion was created by incorporating Spanish recruits, a 5th by adding Italian recruits, and the 6th and final battalion consisted of Belgian Dutch elements. There's also like the story of the Le Belge as the tireur au cul of the Boudin. We will talk about that later, but this refers actually to 40 years later, like the Belgian refusal during the French-Prussian War to help Napoleon III, for which the song says, basically Dries Boudin, this would be a sort of sausage parting of some sort for everybody, for the Alsatians, the Swiss, the Lorrainese, but not for the Belgians, because they are, those who know French know what the insult consists on. But I will not explain it because it's a bit vulgar. But, you can sort of imagine to some degree. Now, shortly thereafter, a 7th battalion even was formed. This, interestingly enough, comprised refugees from Poland. We are, in fact, in the aftermath of the failed November uprising of 1830. Which also brought to the death of our beloved von Clausewitz. But this is exactly the times, like the general temper of the time. It was a pretty dark and sort of unstable one, hardly like some sort of century of stability and tranquility. So this new unit counted in total just over 3,500 men, all right? However, the practical implementation of these project provided challenging already, even with such few troops, because let's say the primary issue was finding the necessary officers and non-commissioned officers. Those within the French army were already too old and insufficient in number, right? This was a young, fresh, turbulent, tough unit, so you needed men with massive attributes just to keep it under, and it would be an actual issue. The initial members of the foreign armed forces often lacked adequate knowledge of the French language to sort of organize a properly now French unit, not just one framed within the broader French army like it had been in the Napoleonic eras, and came from diverse military traditions or from different branches, such as the cavalry, for example. All right. So between 1831 and 1836, it's estimated only 107 officers were in service in the Foreign Legion, approximately half the number stipulated by the regulations. This was not a very promising beginning. An even more pressing problem was the creation within the Legion, and this is actually the core of the matter, that really makes this the greatest example of esprit de corps, in fact of the very latter, that is, a sense of discipline and cohesion that the men could take pride in spite of coming all from different places, and definitely having common ideals that were conflictual with the ones of the same, say, the stability of the French state. Naturally, the esprit de corps is necessary, indispensable for the Legion to assume the status of not just a unit but an elite one that could be spent abroad, making like probably the dirtiest of the work, and being smeared in blood every time, but gaining in this sense this irreplaceable experience that was yet to be gained, at least as a sole unit. So that the only way to ensure that this heterogeneous group of men could coexist was through the strict enforcement of military discipline, applied with absolute rigor and accompanied by severe penalties for those who transgressed. Despite this, insubordination and desertions were prevalent from the very beginning. It was, in many ways, just the world of the time. But less than 2 months after the Legion's formation, the internal atmosphere within the unit had become so volatile that the French National Guard was summoned to manage an actual rebellion, which brought to the arrest of 20 soldiers. This tells you what was happening. Essentially, these troops felt that they had been somehow betrayed, that were now to serve a regime that was not really the ideal one. They had sort of fled evidently as people very, very bad background in many ways from their respective countries, that now, out of rage and frustration, would have liked to implement in France as well. So the Colonel Christophe von Stoffel, a Swiss nobleman who was in the command of the Legion, breathed a sigh of relief when shortly thereafter, and without further delay, the unit was not banished further, was not disbanded, was not just stigmatized and criminalized, but dispatched, a fair deal, to Algeria, where its restless soldiers could be diverted to combat duties. So they wanted really to play the rough way. Well, welcome to the North African Berber resistance. So the war itself would actually work. That's the point, right? And it has this transfigurative, redeeming, transforming power, ultimately serving as the catalyst, the ultimate catalyst that united these stateless, in some cases their actual countries had been literally wiped from the map at this point, stateless men through profoundly deep bonds, and an esprit de corps that was to be envied by armies worldwide, right? They served, by the way, with some penal criminals that the French had organized into a unit as well, but the Foreign Legion in Algeria was really alone. It's not in France anymore. So having severed all connections with the outside world and isolated in a hostile territory inhabited by ruthless enemies, the legionaries discovered that their comrades were the only family and friends that they could rely on, right? And this is really what builds that sort of trust and bond that only the military actually allows you, like in its specific way, to establish. The Foreign Legion itself as a unit would become the legionnaires' homeland, right? The sole community that at that point had embraced them, and importantly, the only one they generally wished to be a part of, because after all, they had a shared past. These were men of, war, not only, but there was that, as we've seen, generally common background for which they had found themselves in such new situation. And after all, that was their real place. Not at home, not in France, but fighting for one of the powers that at least was also sort of the more progressive for their taste, at least to some degree. During the 19th century, the Foreign Legion was thus primarily used to protect and expand the French colonial empire. Right. Today I will not list the entire curriculum of the French Foreign Legion because it would become insane just to talk about every single just intervention worldwide, but that alone speaks volumes of the quality of this unit. The legions initially was engaged in, as we've seen, Algeria, where between 1831 and 1847 it participated to the, say, pacification and extension of the colony. And there is a very important military episode occurring in this theater on June the 28th, 1835. A French column consisting of approximately 5,000 men, led by the General Alphonse Trezel, was marching in disarray toward their base at Arza, pursued by the Algerian horsemen of the Emir Abd al-Qadir. Not a good situation. In the preceding days, the French had in fact suffered defeat in an ambush along the Zig River. Salvation seemed impossible. The troops had lost both cohesion and confidence, transforming their march into de facto rout. By the banks of the Makhtar River, we are in the northwest of Algeria, 15,000 men of the emir had set another ambush to finish the French off. They were really determined to deliver the final blow on the foreigners. However, 300 men from the Legion mounted an unyielding resistance, preventing the Algerians from achieving their objective, though they left behind a third of their brave but limited forces. This encounter would start to found the Legion of the Foreign Legion and its, say, valor in desperate situations. In the ensuing years, the Foreign Legion was dispatched with increasing intensity to locations where France needed to defend her interests. One was the First Carlist War in Spain in 1835. There would be a Spanish Foreign Legion created there, and after the war, some elements of the had previously been part of the French Foreign Legion would actually be part of this unit. Then you have the Crimean War in 1854, where the French behaved very competently together with the Sardinians and the Turks. The British actually were, I don't know what happened there with them, but it was sort of just the Russians on the other side made the worst possible, gave the worst possible display. Then there is the Second Italian War of Independence in 1859. There is a massive French involvement, allied with the force of the Kingdom of Sardinia against the Austrians. And speaking of, in fact, Habsburgic connections, you have the French intervention in Mexico in 1863 to support this time the Habsburg Mexican Emperor Maximilian I, that Napoleon III had wanted on that throne and was keeping to support. You know that story would end quite tragically. Maximilian was the brother of Franz Joseph. Just yesterday we were talking about the Habsburgs and him, and actually the brother said, "What the hell are you going to Mexico for?" And if anything, we'll talk about that war because it's quite really interesting. I also made a video about the American-Mexican War that is a bit like the reason why the Mexicans had sort of veteran forces at that point that Maximilian sort of underestimated during the rebellion. In any case, as far as the French Foreign Legion is concerned, there is this the most important day of the unit, covered in blood and heroism. The date is April the 30th, 1863, firmly etched in the memory of every legionnaire, celebrating the corps, right, at its utmost. On that day in Mexico, a company led by Captain Jean d'Anjou, the famous Jean d'Anjou, consisting of 62 legionnaires and 3 officers, accompanied a convoy to the besieged city of Puebla when they were attacked by 3,000 Mexicans. The mindset of d'Anjou is crystal strong, other than just clear. I will talk about the Battle of Camerone because it's really like a very educational from a strategical point of view and decision-making, leadership, not just the actual sacrifice of the legionnaires. The legionnaires were attacked by 3,000 Mexicans, and d'Anjou's detachment sought refuge on a farm near the fatal village of Camerone. And after hours of fighting, only 6 survivors remained from the French side. These were, again, 65 originally. When their ammo was exhausted, these people don't back down. They charge the enemy in a bayonet attack, which, as you know, in the history of warfare is just like this supreme moment, like in infantry to infantry engagement, of, say, the moral superiority of the attackers. These are essentially suiciding themselves, but deciding to die gloriously, and 3 are actually killed, while the other 3 who were wounded were brought before the Mexican commander, the Colonel Milan, who allowed them to actually return to the French lines as a guard of honor for the body of the fallen Captain d'Anjou that had willingly sacrificed himself, and there was actually nothing that could be done there, but the decision to just stand and to give time to the French to occupy this force, and we'll see it again in a dedicated video. It's really astonishing. And famously enough, the captain had a wooden hand, which is still preserved. It had originally been lost during this engagement, but it was later found and returned to the Legion that treasures it as, one of the greatest relics possible. In fact, it's now kept in a display case at the Legion Museum in Aubagne. And every year, on the day of Camerone, during the Legion celebration, d'Anjou's hand holds a place of honor in the parade, regarded as the most precious of relics. The first French Foreign Legion engagement in combat on French soil occurred, guess when? During the Franco-Prussian War, in fact, of 1870. This also marks, again, like a bit an important moment in its military history. Also, the song fundamentally refers, as we said before, to at least to the diplomatic situation before, during the war. However, the French Foreign Legion was meant to, as they were actually told during one of these very expeditions abroad, and more specifically in places that, as their commander, the General François de Négrier, sounded like Vous, légionnaires, vous êtes soldats pour mourir, et je vous envoie où l'on meurt. That is to say, you, legionnaires, are soldiers, essentially made to die, of the kind made to die, and I send you where people die, right? This was actually said exactly in these years at their return overseas for the Tonkin campaign. So we're talking today's Vietnam, from June 1883 to April 1886. They were also sent against China in 1883. The expansion of the French colonial empire in equatorial Africa then prompted the Foreign Legion to fight in Dahomey between 1892 and 1894, in West Africa against the Mandingo against in 1894, and ultimately to take part in the Second French expedition to Madagascar in 1895. Naturally, the French Foreign Legion participated to both wars, with great loss of life as well. During the Great War, the Foreign Legion was recalled to French soil, where it became intensely involved in numerous challenging battles, serving in the demanding roles of a shock force in attacks, or as the last line of emergency in defense, which, especially considering positional warfare, trench warfare, I will make soon a video describing it in a more hardcore fashion. These are really the worst and bloodiest situations you can think of. Shock force against the trenches, and you know how poorly like these actually moved this huge fortified frontier from Switzerland to the North Sea, and or like there was actually a breakthrough, like you're the essentially the only hope for the entire system to hold, right, and repulse. Like people who have gone through that hellish experience at least will be exhausted. At least this is really what you want to, the kind of unit you want to count on at that point, an elite reserve or a shock force of kind. Now, the losses endured and the honors earned by the Foreign Legion significantly elevated its reputation at this point, leading to an extraordinary increase in enlistments. This is really when the myth of the Legion was, if you want, to also popularized. There were movies made later on in the following decades about them. And during the initial post-war period, the Foreign Legion's forces reached a total of 30,000 men, unprecedented for the unit, and organized into 5 infantry regiments and 1 cavalry one. There are various specialties in the French Foreign Legion, also the airborne one, for example. We'll see later also having like a quite elite role, and they're pretty bold also political positioning at a point. The cavalry regiment, by the way, was established on the initiative of the General Jean Mordac, who advocated for a legion that would adopt a more complete and self-sufficient organizational structure. Consider that at this point, the aforementioned trench warfare would be gradually surpassed. The French were toying a lot at this point with the idea, of course, of a mobile armored force, but say not, as you know, looking at Falgelb actually in the fully right way, but they were on the fore, and so now the surpassing of the French brought on the fore again even the idea of cavalry, that especially abroad, however, was that useful against enemies that in fact used cavalry themselves because the territory was suited for it. This is the case in fact, of the following participation in the Rif War in Morocco, together with the Spanish, against the local resistance from 1920 to 1925. And during this war, another influential figure arose who would profoundly impact the history of the Legion, right? Giving it a backbone and a tradition and some standards that would really make it the elite corps that we know. And so transforming it into a renowned and renewed myth for the one that had, as we've seen, already developed. We're talking about the General Paul-Frédéric who was appointed head of the Inspection de la Légion étrangère, so to say, essentially checking how the efficiency of this unit, and that became affectionately known by the same as le père de la Légion, so the father of the Legion. Why? Because he played a pivotal role from this position, playing in the well-being of the legionnaires, both during their service and after their discharge, which was important, considering now all the people who were part of the unit and the, let's say, the elite standards that now we're profiling just because of this pretty strong experience and tradition that the Legion had acquired. Rollier dedicated 33 years to his soldiers. He was really that caring, establishing the very rights and traditions that sort of distinguish the Legion. In fact, one of this stands in their uniform, of the white kepi, distinguishing the legionnaires. This was already a thing before, but it was officially introduced by regulation in this period. The white kepi is the distinctive headdress of the Foreign Legion. Initially, why? Because the legionnaires wore initially the standard kepi of the infantry troops and also adopted various of the headdresses as needed. For example, in Mexico, the legionnaires were equipped with sombreros, right? And we don't have to think, even during contemporary era, like uniformity being actually like a literal, like sort of every soldier being identical to one another. However, during the first African operations, say the later ones we've seen in equatorial Africa, the standard kepi was protected by a beige fabric collar, often featuring a rear flap to shield the neck from the sun's rays. And due to prolonged exposure to the sun and repeated washing, the kepi's color literally faded, gradually becoming lighter until it turned white, thereby distinguishing recruits from veterans and serving a proud testament to the latter's years of service. In other words, the true, let's say, battle-hardened veteran of the Legion would be distinguished by the fact that his headgear was so consumed and white, and that became the hallmark of the legionary. Officers and non-commissioned officers with more than 15 years of seniority, on the other hand, wore a black kepi because, at least as you've seen, the origin of white was not that sort of edifying, so at least this meant like we have the better hats that do not consume themselves, but actually now they turn to be really something else. Now, during the Second World War, there is actually a minor role played by the legionnaires, if anything, because France had been knocked out. So yes, there were French forces fighting in many theaters. They were tremendous in that also just symbolical fashion. But as we'll see now, in the case of the French Foreign Legion, also quite incisive. This was used in the campaigns in Norway, Syria, in North Africa. And it was in Libya especially, where they faced the Italian troops, that they endured actually their most challenging test, right? Think about this when you look at the French and the Italians in that sort of strange, stereotypical way. Videos about this, because some actually the hardest combats ever fought during World War II for some of these nationalities. In fact, the French Foreign Legion demonstrated also in this case their work commensurate with the reputation that they had earned over more than a century of history. This is to be found at the Battle of Bir Hakeim. This took place between May the 26th and June the 11th, 1942. This is a very important phase of the Battle of Gazala. I should actually make a video about North Africa, the North African front during World War II. As you know, this had been orchestrated by General Erwin Rommel to capture Tobruk. And elements of the Legion defended a large redoubt located at the southern end of the British defensive line, showing how, by the way, the Allies, of course, considered the Legionnaires like a picked unit, because, as you know, that's where you risk the outflanking, so you need some stout, resilient unit. And what a hell of a display, what a hell of a confirmation this was. In fact, the Legionnaires' resistance against the Italian troops was so tenacious, and the retreat was only ordered after their ammunition had been exhausted. This sounds almost like a World War I scenario, where literally you couldn't break through until the enemy had literally exhausted the ammo. But there are naturally many other heroic episodes of, say, scattered here and there. Like, it's easy to find them if you have some literary background, and if you want, at some point we'll sort of look at them more in depth. Now, in the immediate post-war period, the Foreign Legion returned, as you know, to Southeast Asia to engage in the First Indochina War. I made a video actually about this as a prelude to a series on the Vietnam War that I never finished, but we could resume it. The war was fought between 1946 and 1954. You know what happened in the end, right? This was really the darkest hour of the French Foreign Legion, because the Corps suffered a tremendous number of casualties, particularly during the disaster of Dien Bien Phu, that, as you know, was fought between March the 13th and May the 7th of the last year of the war. Of course, like was lost by the French, despite also this some of the support had been given to them. This battle marked the first of a cascade of defeats that would ultimately lead to the decline of the French colonial presence around the globe as a whole. And as you know, the Americans had some experience in the same corner of the same as well. There is also the other very important chapter of the Algerian War of Independence between 1954 and 1962, which in fact, as you understand here, chronologically is just a continuation of that decay. And the Foreign Legion, for multiple reasons, came perilously close to dissolution, in spite of all this great history. This was definitely a troubled time in general, also in the history of France. And of course, the defeat in Indochina had already sort of created like a shadow a bit on the Legion. But the main reason why the dissolution was contemplated is that several of the Legion's officers and soldiers, and primarily the ones from the 1st Foreign Parachute Regiment, like a spearhead of the Corps, like a very prestigious and decorated elite unit within the elite corps, participated in a coup d'état, famously enough, against the French president Charles de Gaulle. That I would actually like to make a video about, also, say, in this this military cut of the story throughout his life. The coup took place between April 21st and 6th of 1961. And if we look at the same historical period during the Cold War, say Levantine crisis, for example, the Legion was involved in the Franco-British intervention during the Suez Crisis, the Battle of Algeria in 1957, which in part had been in fact connected with the previous coup, but at least by the same people who had conducted it. Other also offensives, right? You have the Major General Maurice Schall, in fact, one of the very instigators of the failed coup d'etat, really promoting the activity, intervention of the Legion. And there are so many big, as you know, historical deals with this. There are the Alsatian communities in North Africa. There is the sense of betrayed France with, say, the emergence of Marxism and the impossibility also of maintaining the empire list due to the new global balance, and so this was a great moment of great crisis for Britain, for France, in their imperial history. In other videos, we have to talk way more about contemporary warfare. In any case, the Legion was saved, as we've seen, from suppression. It actually remained like a cornerstone, of the French armed forces, also in a statal political sense, continuity with order and stability, and in spite of the sort of the alternation of governments, political directions. You know that France had quite tumultuous years during the contestations, but during the same decades, the 1960s, the 1970s, there was the risk of a new revolution in France, so it was a big deal of an issue. The Legion's regiments evolved into a rather, say, a rapid response force designed to protect French interests in former colonies and beyond, of course. A strategy that was based, in fact, on this more highly qualitative interventions by very expert personnel to really solve major issues. There would be a lot to digress also the way, for example, the French managed to successfully handle guerrilla in Algeria, right? It was mostly like a political, internal reason in France why that war was lost, but it's not like the myth here that the Westerners cannot win against guerrilla. This is not actually the point. Technically speaking, the French were very good at unnesting the insurgents, and again, very effective counter-guerrilla tactics. It takes time and will politically. That's another thing. And if you have a bunch of, raging communists at home that tell you that, of course, war is wrong, and this sort of idiotic, politically literate ideas, are gonna have a hard time with that. There's a great sense of betrayal, etc. But if you look at these decades, you also realize that the Foreign Legion strategy of employment, let's say, harkens back to the military unit's roots, right? When it could be deployed to conflict zones around the world at a moment's notice and with peak of operational readiness. The troops of the Legion served as an interposition force during the Chad-Libya War of 1969-1972, for example. This marked the Legion's first participation in a military operation since the Algerian War, therefore it was very important. At Kolbezi, that is located in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, in May 1978. In 1981, certain elements of the Foreign Legion joined the multinational force in Lebanon. In 1990, by the way, several of its regiments, together with other French forces, participated in the Opération Daguet in the Persian Gulf. This was the code name assigned to France's involvement in the Gulf War. The Legion also played a crucial role in evacuating French and foreign nationals from Rwanda, Gabon, and Zaire. Additionally, it was redeployed as a peacekeeping force in Cambodia, Somalia, in Sarajevo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, as well as in the Central African Republic, Congo, Kosovo, and the Côte d'Ivoire. More recently, it was involved, for example, in Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. It served as an interposition force in the conflict that has engulfed Mali. So we're looking at a really remarkable force to today consists of approximately 8,000 men organized into 11 regiments. You see how the regimental organization remained the base of the corps since the beginning. You just add these units. And you understand also how it resized from, say, of course, like World War I, that was like the peak of that sort of also greater national mobilization. So it's all explained. It's a very elite unit. Despite the recent opening of enlistment to French citizens, foreign nationals, in fact, still make up the majority of the Legion. And despite the recent opening of enlistment to French citizens, foreign nationals still make up the majority of the Legion, comprising about 3/4 of the force and representing 140 different nationalities. Their training is notable, not only for its physical demands, but also for its psychological challenges, which are aimed at fostering an unshakable moral resilience among the recruits. This is not really a video to explain discipline, but let's say at the end of the day, it's the very act of joining the Legion along with the soldiers' connections to its traditions that forms the crucial and invaluable foundation of their steadfast self-discipline in combat. There is a code of honor that explains you how they really work. This was adopted in the 1980s. It's 7 statements. 1. As a legionnaire, you are a volunteer who serves France with honor and loyalty. 2. Every legionnaire is your brother in arms, regardless of his nationality, race, or religion. You must always demonstrate the close solidarity that binds the members of a family. 3. Respectful of tradition, loyal to your leaders, disciplined and committed to camaraderie are your strengths. Courage and loyalty are your virtues. 4. Proud of your status as a legionnaire, you express it through your always elegant uniform, your consistently dignified yet modest behavior, and your always clean and tidy accommodation. 5. As an elite soldier, you train rigorously, maintain your weapon as your most treasured possession, and remain constantly focused on your physical fitness. The mission is sacred, and you will see it through the very end. If necessary, you will so even at the cost of your own life during an operation. 7. In combat, act without passion and without hatred. Show respect for defeated enemies, and never abandon your dead, your wounded, or your weapons. This is really powerful, honestly. And if you talk about like the general routine of a legionnaire, you can see sort of the intensity of such exercises. At 6 a.m. you have a wake-up call. From 6 a.m. to 6:20 a.m. you have to shave, curate your personal hygiene, and clean the room. At 6:20 a.m. you have the roll call. At 6:30 a.m. you have breakfast. 6:45 a.m. to 7 a.m. you have the cleaning of the company and facilities. 7:15 a.m. cleaning outside the company. 8 a.m. assembly in the company area. 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. sports activity. 9:30 a.m. to 11:45 a.m. training or work. 12 p.m. lunch. 12:45 p.m. cleaning of the company and facilities. 1:15 p.m. cleaning outside the company. 1:30 p.m. company assembly. 1:30 p.m. to 5:45 p.m. training or work. 6 p.m. dinner. 6 p.m. free exit with permission at all night. 10:30 p.m. curfew or lights are turned off. Now, as you understand, this is also, of course, something you can't compare to other schedules and lifestyles and other units, etc. But there is, of course, a rigor that makes every unit this spiritual entity above the sum of the individuals. The soldiers in the French Foreign Legion, as you understand, have this peculiarity of hailing from diverse military backgrounds, and this diversity has become an opportunity, of course, to enhance their cohesion and collaborative skills, thereby amplifying the distinct qualities of each individual. This is not to be underestimated, right? Because if you manage really to exploit the best of every element and sort of test the boundaries of everybody involved, because this is not really a walk in the park, it's an incredibly tough, violent, and brutal experience. In many ways, you are, however, able to really squeeze out the best out of the force, and providing with those standards that the Corps is really famous for. Although the French Foreign Legion is a part of the French army, it is the only unit that does not swear allegiance to France, but rather to the Foreign Legion itself. This is also a radically important aspect. Like, before everything, but think about the Marines, right? Everything comes just after the Corps, right? Including God. And this is so powerful for men, again, that are involved, again, from mostly different backgrounds from the French one, but that are in fact striving to obtain the French citizenship that can be requested. By the way, it's not even automatic after 3 years of service. And there is this beautiful phrase, français par le sang versé, which also rhymes, which means French for bloodshed. That is to say, any soldier who is wounded in combat for the country can immediately apply to become a French citizen under such provision. And the privilege has not been afforded to the nearly 40,000 men who, since 1831, have died while wearing the Legion's uniform, fighting in over 30 countries around the world. You see, each one of these statements should be sort of deserving a video on its own, but it's obvious that starting from these frames, like, we can appreciate further what this, also the context is about, why this force exists, and where does this immense pride and and privilege and tradition comes from. And I hope, as usual, that this can lead to further expansion of this topic discussion, plus like some sort of more thorough observation of these forces' involvement, their background, their story, and again, hopefully we will get there. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.